Catherine Porter is an energy consultant experienced in electricity, gas, and oil markets, as well as risk management and financing. She's a chartered fellow of the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment. I think it's an industry body, Catherine, and a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Energy Studies. She holds a master's degree in physics from the University of Exeter, an MBA from London Business School. Now, I feel pretty lucky that we have got hold of her this evening because I sense that the wheels are beginning to come off net zero, and Catherine finds herself in very, very high demand.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I am indeed an energy expert. I'm also quite left-brained, so I'm looking forward to world domination any day now. And I wasn't actually planning to begin this with jokes. It's not supposed to be stand-up. But there is a joke, it's quite an old joke, and it goes like this. Question: what did communists use before candles? Answer: electricity. And unfortunately, this is starting to look a little bit prophetic. And I'm going to try and explain why in this talk. And I'm also going to challenge you a little bit with some concepts around physics that you may remember from school. So I'm going to talk first of all about the gas market, because that, I think, is more intuitive to people. Gas is something tangible. We kind of can understand what it is. You can't necessarily see it, but you can fill a balloon. You understand that if you put more gas into something, the pressure will go up. So we divide our market into three sections. We have the upstream section, and this is where you bring in the gas out of the ground. In the power sector, that's electricity generation. Then you have the midstream section, and this is the pipes, the wires, the storage, and also trading comes into that category. And then you have the downstream section, which is retail. It's where suppliers sell to homes and businesses. Now, we privatized our gas and electricity markets back in the 1980s. Some of you might remember the "If you see Sid, tell him" campaign for the privatization of British Gas, which remains the most successful public share subscription in British history. And at that time, the generators were separated from the network companies. And then in 2000, you had the creation of suppliers. And the idea is that if you own a network, which is a monopoly, you're not allowed to sell to homes and businesses. So in fact, the people that sell gas and electricity to you, they're essentially accountants. They do some accounting to make sure that you pay for the gas and electricity that you use, and that's essentially all that they do. Now, if we think about how the market works, it's very linked to the physics of gas and electricity, far more than any other type of market. When you put your gas into your pipeline network, you have a high-pressure pipeline system, which is a little bit like motorways, there to get large volumes of gas to move around the country. And then you have lower pressure pipe systems that bring that gas into homes and businesses. Now, the gas grid operator, National Gas, they control the operation of that high-pressure pipeline. And because this is a physical commodity, you have to be careful. If you put too much gas into the pipes and you don't take it out, then eventually the pressure will build up, and you go beyond the material integrity of the pipes, and things will literally blow up, and that's not a good thing. People complain about that happening. And so every person, every business that transacts on the high-pressure system, whether they're taking gas in or taking gas off, they have to notify the system operator every day how much they're going to put in, how much they're going to take out. And that taking out, that can just be selling it to somebody else. So you might have a company like Harbour Energy, which is the biggest oil and gas producer in the North Sea, and they will notify National Gas that so much gas is going to turn up on the beach every day, and they will sell that to maybe a gas generator, and that transaction happens effectively delivered at the high-pressure network. And because you can actually vary the pressure inside the gas pipes, you have some flexibility. This is actually one of the coolest things about the gas market, is that storage capacity in the pipes is called line pack, and it's something that actually is optimized to make the gas system work as efficiently as possible. And because of this flexibility, the gas market's only balanced once a day. Now, unfortunately, you can't squash electricity. You can't squeeze more into the wires. Electricity is very difficult to store, and it's not compressible, and therefore we balance the electricity market every half an hour. Now, electricity has another property that's very different from gas, and this is where we're going to get into a little bit more of the science. So some of you might remember from school where you'd get a battery and you'd connect up a little light bulb, and then you'd see what happened if you connected another light bulb, and does it get brighter or less bright, and so on. And these batteries are using direct current. It doesn't change with time. And there's a very straightforward relationship between voltage, current, and resistance. Voltage is equal to current times by resistance. So if you increase the resistance, then for the same voltage, your current will drop. Now, back in the early days of electricity, you had two pioneers, Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. Thomas Edison actually built the first commercial power station in the UK at Holborn Viaduct in London, and he connected up a whole load of streetlights that previously were powered with gas, and that was pretty inconvenient because every day people had to go and light these lamps and then turn them off again in the morning. So his power station fired a few hundred lights in the Holborn area. And he was very keen on direct current because he was using electric motors, and in those days there just weren't any electric motors of any quality that worked on alternating current. Nikola Tesla, on the other hand, he was interested in transporting electricity over long distances. Now, the wires that you use to transmit electricity have resistance in them. So the longer the wire, the more resistance. And so the more distance you try to transmit your electricity, the bigger your losses, and the less energy you get out at the end. So he wanted to use higher voltage to offset this effect and transmit electricity over long distances. Now, in those days, they were both using effectively the same method of generating electricity. Edison's version just had a modification. Now, this is a fundamental property of magnetism. If you take a magnet, and let's say you have it in a horseshoe shape, so the north and south poles are facing each other, and then you take another magnet and put it between those poles, and you put a wire on it, and you then rotate that magnet in the middle, you induce a current inside the wire. And that current will vary, the current and the voltage will vary in line with the speed at which your magnet is turning. And you get a nice sine wave. And this is fundamentally linked to the turning of your magnet. Now, because we want to generate lots of electricity, we put these magnets onto really big turbines. And then we turn those turbines at 3,000 revolutions per minute. And that means you get your current and your voltage changes at 50 cycles per second. So 50 times by 60 seconds in a minute, that's your 3,000. And we call this property frequency. And it's a really important property within our electricity market because our electrical equipment is really sensitive to this. If your frequency goes up or goes down, then your equipment will break. Your power stations will break. Your transformers will break. Your computers will break. Everything will break if the voltage isn't at the right level. And so all the equipment connected to the grid has fail-safes in it, protection measures. If that frequency goes outside their operational tolerance, they turn themselves off to protect themselves from damage. Now, this frequency is also connected with supply and demand. And here we can go back to our gas grid analogy. If you put more gas into your pipes than you take out, your pressure goes up. If you put more electricity onto your power grid than you use, your frequency goes up. And it's going to try to turn your turbines faster. And similarly, if you have more people trying to use electricity than you're generating, it'll try and slow them down. Now then we come to renewables. Wind and solar don't generate alternating current, at least not in a way that the grid can use. So they take direct current and then they convert it to alternating current using electronics. And these electronics are passive. They look at the wave of current and voltage and they say, is that behaving in the way that we expect? Yes, okay, we'll connect, we'll inject our electricity. And if not, they just don't participate. They turn off, or they don't connect in the first place. Now, the more that we put renewables on the grid and take away our conventional generation, the fewer units we have creating our lovely wave of current and voltage to start with, and also we have less ability to resist changes to that frequency. And this was really what we saw in Iberia with their power cut the other week. Now, they experienced some sort of a fault, and we don't know yet what the original cause was, but grid faults happen, equipment breaks, lightning might strike the network, there might be a fire, and smoke interferes with the resistance qualities of air, and so you can get arcing between the lines. These things happen, and all power grid operators are used to dealing with them. But if your grid is primarily using wind and solar, it becomes really unstable. You have a variation in your frequency, they just turn themselves off. But your conventional generators, your gas turbines, your nuclear turbines, your hydroelectric turbines, they're big, heavy machines. They resist changes to their speed of motion. And this is a property called inertia. And it's extremely important within our power grids. Without this inertia, it's very hard to keep your voltage and your current changing in a nice, stable way. So when they had this grid fault in Iberia, generation got disconnected because the frequency in their local area went outside the operational tolerance. But then the next generation along, instead of their inertia putting a brake on that change, they just turned off as well because it was solar and it was wind. And their electronics just went, oh, we don't like this, we're just going to stop. And so very quickly, within minutes, the entire Iberian power grid collapsed. They had a full and complete blackout. Now, this fault also then propagated into France. But France has a very high inertia grid. Their electricity comes from nuclear and hydroelectric, big, heavy spinning mass. And so as soon as this fault propagated into France, inertia suddenly kicked in, and the extent of the blackouts was very limited geographically, and they were able to restore power within under an hour. In Iberia, it took them until the following morning, and unfortunately, 7 people lost their lives. And since I started my business 9 years ago, I've warned that blackouts would be fatal, particularly if they happened in winter. And I always had the sense that people felt I was being a bit dramatic. But now we see a blackout in very benign weather conditions, and 7 people unfortunately lost their lives. So this is no joke. By putting renewables on our power grids, we are putting a type of generation that is fundamentally incompatible with the way our grids are designed and operate. And we expect it to work normally. And not only that, because we've been prioritizing investing in connecting all of these renewables, and renewables have low energy density, so you need a lot more wires than you do for conventional generation. If I wanted to build a reasonably sized gas power station, that would be maybe 800 megawatts, and it will have one grid connection. An 800 megawatt wind farm is 60 turbines. But wind farms, they only have a capacity factor of 35%, which essentially means they only work about a third of the time. So on an equivalent annual energy basis, you'd need 3 times the turbines. So that's 180 times the wires that you need for your gas power station. Guess who pays for that? So the other problem, so we've spent all our money connecting all of these renewables and all these hundreds and hundreds of wires. We've neglected our legacy infrastructure. So we've got our power grid that we started building in 1926. Next year, 100-year anniversary of the Electricity Act. Conservative government nationalized the whole electricity industry, started building the high voltage power network. But a lot of our kit is getting old. The transformers that caught fire near Heathrow last month, they were from the 1960s. So we're expecting this old, creaky electricity grid to now work in a way it was never designed to work. Now, you might remember me saying that this frequency property is connected with the balance between supply and demand, and we have to keep that monitored in half-hourly chunks. Every gust of wind, every cloud affects the output of your wind and solar generators. So the job that National Grid, the NESO it's called now, National Energy System Operator, has to do to keep that frequency stable has just become a huge amount more difficult. A lot more difficult and a lot more expensive. Billions of pounds a year more expensive. Have a guess who's paying for that? Now, people think that renewables are free. Lots of people say that renewables are free. The wind and the sun are free. Well, yes, it's true. The wind and the sun are free. But the machines that convert the wind and the sun into electricity are not free. Now, they're actually pretty expensive. And we have to subsidize them. Now, the most recent subsidy, we call it AR6, means allocation round 6, happened last year. The subsidy price for offshore wind converted into today's money, because they always quote it in 2012 money, so it looks cheaper, but converted into today's money, £83 per megawatt hour. Now, this gas market price that everybody complains about, the average of that gas market price that's supposed to be very expensive in 2024, that was £73 a megawatt hour. £10 a megawatt hour cheaper than the most recent wind subsidies. Now, unfortunately, we've just been told by Ørsted, which is one of the biggest developers of wind farms in Britain, that £83 a megawatt hour is just not enough. They cancelled their biggest project in AR6. They said, we can't make the economics work at £10 a megawatt hour more than the expensive wholesale gas price that everybody's complaining about. But oh yes, renewables are cheap. And then who do you think is paying for the subsidies? You. They come through our bills. But then I also mentioned that renewables don't work all the time. And so we have to build an entire separate set of generation to work for the 2/3 of the time when renewables aren't working. And our highest period of demand happens in the winter at dinner time. Guess what you don't have in the winter at dinner time? Solar energy. There is zero solar energy during our peak energy demand in the winter. And so, of course, we now have to pay primarily gas power stations to be available to work when it's not windy and sunny. Have a guess who's paying for that? Also coming through our bills. We are paying billions of pounds a year in subsidies, environmental levies, and carbon taxes. The total amount is £17 billion a year, and that is increasing. And almost all of that is added onto our electricity bills. And so when people tell you that renewables are cheap, that renewables will lower your energy bills, this is not true. And if the renewables in question are intermittent and depend on the weather, it will never be true. This is a fiction, and it's a very dangerous fiction that people are being sold. The only way to decarbonize our electricity system in a way that will be reliable, that won't cause disruptions and problems like we saw in Iberia, is to build nuclear power. And nuclear power has high energy density, so you don't need very many wires. It produces alternating current, exactly the way the grid was designed for. It will run all the time, so you don't need any backup. It runs the way you expect it to. It doesn't vary, so you don't need to have high balancing costs. It is exactly plug and play with the way our grids were designed. Unfortunately, it's expensive, but we've made it more expensive than it needs to be because we took our eye off the ball with regulation. So our nuclear regulators now have rules that are the equivalent of having to have 57 seatbelts when you're driving your car. If somebody told you you needed 57 seatbelts, you'd think that they'd lost their minds. So if you hear people saying we're going to make nuclear regulations easier, that doesn't mean it's less safe. It just means they're going back to a sensible number of seatbelts. And I think on that note, it's probably a good place to stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I just want to we'll have a few questions. I'll have ask a few questions, and then we'll throw it open to everybody on the floor to ask any questions that they like. Can you tell me, So when Ed Miliband claims that it's all free or it's all going to be cheaper, I mean, where's he getting this from and how is he getting away with it?
So an investment bank called Lazard came up with a metric a few years ago called the levelized cost of energy. And by their own admission, this was a pretty selective measure. If you read the small print, you'd see that it didn't include a lot of the costs that you have associated with delivering reliable generation to people's homes. So I'm more interested in the full system cost. What does it cost to make sure that when I press my light switch, the light comes on, and that it always comes on regardless of when I press it or how many other people are pressing their light switches at the same time? But unfortunately, that's not what the Lazard measure looked at. It really was just very much focused on short-run marginal operating costs, which obviously for wind and sun are very low. But if you only ran your electricity system using wind and sun, you wouldn't be able to rely on being able to have the light on every time you press the switch. So it's an artificial measure that everybody jumped on because it supported the stories they wanted to tell.
Have you thought about why these policies have become so widely accepted? I know we briefly just talked about COVID, lockdowns and so on before we began, but have you thought about, what's behind this sort of mass psychology of the striving for net zero?
Okay, so I don't want to get too much into the climate debate itself. I'm actually not especially interested in climate science. I'm more interested in the policy outcomes of what people think that climate science tells them. If you ask people, do they care about the climate? Then of course they say yes. I mean, what sort of a psychopath doesn't care about the climate? If you start asking people how much they're willing to pay to do something about it, they'll give you a rather different answer. But effectively, you've had a lot of well-meaning people form the belief that something has to be done. Then the question is, what is that something? Now, policymakers tend to prefer plug-and-play solutions. This is why they're pushing heat pumps. This is why they push electric cars. They don't look at the supply chain for electric cars and the pollution that's caused, and wind farms are even worse. The pollution from the extra mining that you have to build wind farms is insane, and for something that only works a third of the time. It's not just an inefficient use of capital, it's a really inefficient use of natural resources. But that happens in some other country to other people. So they don't notice that. They just have this green utopia that I liken to a child's drawing of a house. If you ask a child to draw a house, then they're going to draw you a little detached house with a chimney stack and maybe a wisp of smoke, and there might be some flowers and some little clouds and little birds in a little V shape in the sky. And it's pretty, but it doesn't reflect how most people live. And people have just been seduced by this green utopia that doesn't exist.
And our media aren't particularly science literate, of course, and can't really subject it to scrutiny.
Yes, that's correct. And it's not just that they're not science literate, they kind of take pride in that. How often will you hear a journalist joking about, how they're terrible at numbers and they can't add up and they don't do maths? In a way that they don't joke about not being able to read or spell. It just seems acceptable to sit back and say, it's science, it's too complicated. And I hope I managed to convince at least some of you that the science behind our power systems is actually perfectly accessible for everybody to understand.
It strikes me that I suppose, and I know you're not hugely interested in the climate itself, but the sort of climate agenda is a kind of religion now, isn't it?
Well, it definitely has a lot of features of a religion. If you look at the language around it, if you question or are skeptical about the orthodoxy around climate, then you're described as a denier. 500 years ago, you were called a heretic and they tried to burn you at the stake. There are certain parallels with that now, which actually is very unscientific in itself. There's no such thing as settled science. No science is settled. Everybody thought that Newtonian mechanics was settled science until they looked at the quantum level and discovered everything worked completely differently and Newton's laws didn't apply. So the more we expand our knowledge, the more we discover that the rules we thought were correct aren't. And science is an ever-changing, ever-progressing field, and it's never, ever settled.
Well, let's talk for a second about the road back from the madness. I mean, if we had, let's say, a reform landslide in the next election, and you got a phone call along the lines of, what should we do to stop all the madness? Make energy as cheap and plentiful as quickly as possible. What sort of things? I mean, you've mentioned nuclear. Yeah. What other things would you be talking about?
Okay, so if I ruled the world, step number one would be to cancel all renewable subsidies going forward, and to look at whether we can do anything about the legacy ones. That's harder, obviously, because they're contracts, so you can't just start tearing them up and expect people to continue to invest in British infrastructure. But I certainly would stop with new ones. The second thing I would do would be I'd go and sign a contract with KEPCO, which is the Korean nuclear company. They have built 8 of their APR 1400 generators, 4 in South Korea and 4 in UAE. They've been built on time and on budget. The cost was about $5 to $6 million US each, and they were built in 8.5 years. I would tear up almost all of the environmental regulations surrounding nuclear generation, because they are, for the most part, spurious. The environmental statements for Sizewell C were about 40,000 pages. Now, Sizewell C is adjacent to Sizewell B and the now decommissioned Sizewell A. So who in the room thinks that there's 40,000 pages worth of different environmental impact on these adjacent sites? But then you can imagine the cost that has associated with it.
Is there any sign that the penny is dropping with Starmer or Kemi?
Well, so I'd say the Conservatives, yes, they've repudiated the net zero 2050 target, and they're doing the work. They're talking to energy experts to say, well, we've decided we were wrong, and I think they've been open about that. They haven't yet decided what they think right looks like, but then, and I do speak to them, and I say, stick to your guns, right? It's 4 years until the next general election. You don't need to make policy announcements now. Make sure you get it right and then announce the policies. Don't rush out with half-baked ideas that aren't ready. Work it through, take the time, and come out with a sensible set of policies. And that's essentially the same advice I would give to Reform. They seem a bit less interested in discussing that with me. But we're far enough away from the election that everybody has the time to get it right. Now, I'd say that with Labour, in some ways, they're starting to get it. They've understood that the government isn't running the country. So we've even heard Starmer say this. The civil service is not accountable to elected ministers. Ministers cannot fire civil servants. And often you'll hear civil servants accusing ministers of bullying. That means the civil servants are being told you need to do this, and they don't want to. And the ministers are like, no, well, no, we're the ministers, you have to do it. And like, oh, no, you're bullying us. So they're wanting to cut Quango's. I think they're doing a pretty poor job of it, but they seem to have at least recognized that something has to be done about unaccountable Quango's and regulatory bodies that are slowing things down. They want to build infrastructure that they're not going to be able to do unless they get some of these organisations under control.
Are you aware of the position in other countries? I mean, has Britain gone a bit more mad than other countries, or where are we in terms of what other countries have done?
We're not more mad, but I'd say the US is leading the charge in getting back to reality. I think Chris Wright is a very good energy secretary. He points out that the trillions of dollars that have been spent globally on the energy transition have impacted the contribution from fossil fuels by something like only 3%. So this is not a transition in any real meaning of the word. It's a sort of minor blip. But the cost of that minor blip is eye-watering. So the US is very much trying to get back to reality. They've recognised that the route to economic growth is cheap energy. That is not a controversial statement by any means. They just disagree with the hypothesis that renewables represent cheap energy. Now, other countries are starting to correct, particularly around nuclear. We're seeing primarily the drive for AI data centres creating huge new additional demand is pushing a new interest in nuclear. Even Germany's reconsidering its nuclear ban. Denmark has just reversed its ban. Spain, there is some strong pressure for them to change course, particularly because of their blackout recently. So I think the biggest change of direction that we're not really committed to here in Britain is a nuclear renaissance.
Right. I thought we might, if there are questions, I'm assuming there are going to be questions either about this particular topic or something else somebody wants to raise from you. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Our deliberately high energy costs are having the result of reducing our energy demand. But how are they doing that? They're not doing it really because of efficiency. They're doing it because people are moving their manufacturing to China and India and other places in Southeast Asia where they have dirtier and cheaper energy. Now, that obviously increases emissions, but then you've got to ship the stuff back. If we go ahead and put electric arc furnaces in at Scunthorpe, that will cut their product capability by a third. And particularly the rails that Network Rail buys probably won't be able to be made from an electric arc furnace. So they'll have to be made elsewhere, probably in China, and then shipped halfway around the world to get here. Shipping bulk heavy items is one of the stupidest things you can do. Now, on the subject of airports, we saw obviously a few weeks ago the incident at Heathrow. So Heathrow, it takes electricity from 3 different substations connected to the grid. Apparently it takes a whole day to move between them. They have emergency diesel generators for their critical safety systems, as most airports do. They probably work for about 4 hours. There's no evidence they didn't do their job in the recent blackout. Heathrow also has a small biomass plant, wood pellets. They're burning wood at Heathrow Airport. They cry about the burning of jet fuel. Wood is dirtier than coal. The emissions coming out of your stack for burning wood are worse than the emissions from a coal plant. And yet they've got this in West London. They would be much better off putting in place a gas-fired power station at Heathrow, which is what JFK has, and exporting back to the grid and have it capable of dual fueling on jet kero in case something happens to the gas supply, and they have a pipeline to Fawley refinery for the kero, so very resilient. But I'd bet you money that they would refuse to do that on the basis that it's so dirty, but burning wood is absolutely fine, because you can plant some trees, obviously.
One quick question. Would you accept a post at Cabinet if Nigel offered you?
I don't want to be an MP, but if they put me in the House of Lords, then I would consider it.
Yes, you can become a lord.
Being a lord has some attractions.
Any other questions? Yes, at the back, yeah.
So I think the reality is if we don't build more gas power stations, it's going to be very hard to keep the lights on. Our gas generating fleet is getting pretty old. We're still running units that were built in the 1990s. Gas turbines generally have a 25 to 30 year life, and the evidence is that they really don't run longer than that. It's not like nuclear where they've been able to secure decades-long extensions. That's just not something you can do with gas turbines. The problem is we've now got 5-year lead times for new gas turbines. So I completely agree that we need to be optimizing our domestic gas production. We need to be thinking very carefully about building new gas power stations, which interestingly the Conservatives did want to do. I'm not sure that Labour's quite on board with that. But as I said, it's going to be extremely hard to keep the lights on. And this is actually why we've seen the extension of the biomass subsidies, despite the controversy around them, is that we've had a near-miss blackout event in January. And I think that concentrated people's minds around security of supply.
There was one here.
So Rolls-Royce has been making small reactors to power submarines for decades. Unfortunately, nuclear submarines use a type of enriched fuel that's not licensed anywhere in the world for civil use because of proliferation concerns. So they're designing a completely new technology for use in civil applications, and it's still 10 years away. Now, actually, GE and Hitachi have just got consent to build small boiling water reactors. It's a slightly different technology. Rolls-Royce is doing pressurized water reactors. Boiling water reactors are simple and easier to scale down, and they're going to start building those any day now in Canada. And so I think they're going to be the first small modular reactors being built in the West. I think that we need to prioritize gigawatt scale reactors because we already know how to build them. Like KEPCO could come and start building today. Rolls-Royce can't build today because they're just not ready. But then encourage the small reactors because there will be a role for them. We also just have to think through a little bit more about the safety case, because it sounds great, we'll just put these nuclear reactors everywhere. But our nuclear power stations have the same security that a high security prison has. They have armed police and a very expensive security arrangement. So I think there's a bit more thinking that has to be done about how you scale that down, particularly if you're going to co-locate those in industries that are dangerous already.
Okay, I think there were, yes, gentlemen here, yeah.
Yes, but I would say as well that the Victorians were rather less concerned about how many people died in building their infrastructure, and I don't think we'd be quite so relaxed about that these days. But I think that we need to legislate to reduce the amenability of major infrastructure projects to judicial review, because those 40,000 pages I was talking about at Sizewell, that's a defensive measure that the regulators put in place to make it harder and more expensive for people to make an application for a judicial review. And so even the fact that they're doing that is adding cost, regardless of whether anybody actually does go ahead and make such an application. So we need to reduce the number of people that have standing and the scope for judicial review, and I think that would significantly reduce the whole approvals and permitting process for these big projects.
Wasn't there a quango, like a nature commission or something, which insisted that for HS2 or one of these developments that they spend 100 million quid on a tunnel to save bats, the bat tunnel. And so you get quangos shoving their oar in as well.
And the other problem is that these organisations look at everything from the bottom up on a site-by-site basis. So it doesn't look at on a nationwide level. Nuclear power has very high energy density, so you get a lot of energy from a very small geographic footprint. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that nuclear power is lethal to newts. Now, it's actually not, but let's say it did. It might be better for the national newt population to have no newts at all at this site where the nuclear power station is, because you now avoid having to build lots of other stuff elsewhere, and then the newts can just go and happily do their newt thing in all these other places. But that's just not how the regulators look, partly because of the way their mandates work. So there's a lot that needs to be done around how the regulators have their mandates. I think they should be required to look at the national interest rather than just site by site, and then that you would get a very different decision-making process.
More questions? At the back again, yeah.
No, it's the lead time for the gas turbines. The supply chains have got very snarled up, partly because people aren't ordering them, so they've diverted resources elsewhere.
Okay.
But you do have big lead times for grid equipment as well, so 4 years for a super transformer, 2 years for normal transformers. When they say that we're going to have to build twice as much grid infrastructure in the next 5 years that we built in the previous 10 to achieve clean power 2030, that's 5 years away, and you've got to wait 4 years for a super transformer, then, you know, let's take a vote on how likely we think that's going to be. So I actually don't think electric cars are green. If you look at how electric cars are made, the large amount of more minerals that you need to make an electric car, the higher energy consumption to make the battery, you have to drive about 10, 15,000 miles before you break even with the production emissions compared with a conventional car. So I only drive about 2,000 miles a year, and, you know, I'll probably die before my car does, so I'm not going to get an electric car. Plus, I wouldn't be able to get a charger because I live in a very rural place. The other big problem with electric cars that nobody talks about is they don't roll. So if you break down, they just stop. You can't push them out of the way. And if you stop on one of those smart motorways, well, good luck getting to one of the refuges. You might just stop dead in the fast lane and have to take your chances. So I wouldn't get one for that reason. And then the other aspect is that because of the extra resources and energy needed to make them, the sustainability question can be framed differently. Excuse me. If you're going to do short journeys, then that's probably the sweet spot for electric cars. But then there are other alternatives like cycling or walking. If you're going to do long journeys, well, why not take public transport? Why not take the train? So where really does the electric car fit in from an environmental perspective? I think there's a very, very small window, and it's just hard to justify if you look at it from, its whole life cycle perspective. And yes, it does cause fires, but actually the bigger fire risk comes from electric bikes and scooters rather than electric cars.
People who have them usually have two cars, don't they? They've got a petrol car, another car. Gentleman down there, yeah.
Okay, so I was actually warning that we were going to come into this risk in around 2027, 28. Now, that risk has been slightly mitigated because the biomass subsidies have been extended, so Drax and Lynmouth won't close in 2027 as they would otherwise have done. And also, we've been extending the lives of the old advanced gas-cooled power stations. So that probably pushes out the risk a little bit further, and it really depends on the rate at which our gas power stations retire, because as I said earlier, some of those are getting old. Now, there are two things that can cause a blackout. One is really what happened on the 8th of January this year, which is straightforwardly running out of generation, and we very nearly ran out of generation that evening. If we'd lost one even medium-sized power station or interconnector, NESO would have had to enact demand control if it was going to prevent a blackout. And because they've not done that in decades, you'd be taking a real risk of could they take the right steps in the right order at the speed necessary to prevent a cascading blackout? And I really question whether they could. Then the other big risk is what happened in Iberia the other week. If you run a low inertia grid, and we are increasingly running a low inertia grid, the day before the Iberian blackout, we had unexplained voltage oscillations in our power grid, which actually caused a power station and an interconnector to disconnect, to trip off. We might not be able to manage frequency within its bounds. So even if we have enough generation, if it's not the right type of generation, we run blackout risks there as well. I have a backup diesel generator at home. But then my house is the very last house on the electricity network where I live, and there's a little cable that runs over some fields to get to my house. So it is a somewhat vulnerable situation. And I'm not on the water or sewage at all. And our septic tank is higher than our drains. So if our power goes out, then our waste backs up pretty quickly. So yeah, our generator is sort of quite important to us.
So you would recommend as a backup we get a generator?
Yeah, absolutely. And the more rurally you live, the more likely you are to already have stuff anyway. So everybody where I live has got really powerful torches. Most people have wood-burning stoves, and obviously you can cook on those. I have a gas-fired auger, which is completely independent of electricity, so that provides my hot water as well as cooking capabilities. So if you have a power cut, your boiler won't work because the boiler requires electricity and your water pumps require electricity. You'd still be able to cook potentially, but your boiler won't work. Whereas if you've got a gas-fired auger like I do, you get hot water. It doesn't provide you with heating, but wood-burning stoves are pretty good for that. It's just thinking about how you can be resilient. And something that I recommend particularly to people with elderly relatives is to have torches and things around the house. Imagine having a blackout at night time and you're by the stairs, for example, and you've got to go up or down the stairs to find a torch. One of the sources, I think, of potential fatalities in the case of a winter blackout would be elderly people falling over in the home. So just keep torches around, don't rely on candles. One of the fatalities in Iberia was a house fire from the use of candles. Just to be having that resilience and think about what would you do if there was a blackout. You can't save the grid with any of these things, but you can maybe save yourselves. Yeah, so I'm now unapologetically referring to our Secretary of State as Mad Miliband, because to spend public money on solar panels and then spend public money on dimming the sun at the same time is...
Joined up thinking.
Well, exactly. So this is a difficult question because one of the things that Miliband is doing is pushing through these projects in the face of local opposition. And they're trying to, we were just talking a minute ago about making it harder for people to block infrastructure projects. And the first place that's going to be used is to put more solar panels in inappropriate places. The World Bank says that the UK is the second worst place in the world for solar energy after Ireland. And so spending all this money is really unjustified. I think the one get out of jail free card is that now they've agreed to basically legislate to prevent GB Energy from having forced and slave labour in its supply chain. And given that 60% of the polysilicon that's used in solar panels comes from the Xinjiang region of China, I think that's probably the most effective opposition, is to basically use people's anti-slavery policies against them, to say you can't build those, and to say to councils you can't approve that solar farm because you can't guarantee the solar panels weren't made using slave labour. So I think that's a very good point. We've had various schemes over the years primarily for insulation, but the low-hanging fruit in that area has largely been picked. Now, what we don't have is knowledge. There really isn't a knowledge base about what measures work in which different property types. We have a huge diversity of properties in this country. So what might reduce energy losses very well in a 1950s bungalow might be the exact wrong thing to do in a Victorian terrace or a Georgian detached house, or a modern, a 1990s semi-detached. And some of the measures that people suggest can make stuff worse. If you have a certain type of building and you fill in your cavity walls, well, cavity walls were there for a reason. They were there to prevent condensation. So if you fill in your cavity wall, you create a moisture bridge that can lead to damp. And damp homes feel cold. So it doesn't really matter whether you're running your heating because you actually are cold, or whether you just feel cold because it's damp. Or now you turned your heating down, but you had to get lots of ventilation and dehumidifiers. That's not reducing your energy consumption. So what we really need is research into which measures actually work in different property types, and then incentivize those. And there are certain ways that can be started with very minimal participation from householders. So, for example, local authorities could go around and do thermal imaging surveys of the properties in their area. And that can be done from the street. You don't need to go into the home to do that. And then they could overlay that with information they have around sort of poverty levels and so on. And that will help them target their assistance at the homes that need it the most, the homes that are the most leaky, that are inhabited by people on the lowest incomes. If you don't measure things, then you're never going to remedy them. And unfortunately, the energy performance certificate does not involve any type of measurement whatsoever. No thermal imaging, no ventilation studies, nothing. There is not a single measurement. It's completely subjective. My house has an EPC of F. I haven't had the central heating on since I moved there. But according to my EPC, the house is practically a barn. So it's just not fit for purpose. Oh, but I'm told if I install a wind turbine, which I'd never get permission for because I live in a conservation area, then in 50 years I might pay back the cost.
The lady here in the middle, yeah.
So the dimming of the sun would definitely reduce the effectiveness of plants to absorb carbon dioxide. So photosynthesis would not work as effectively if there was less sunlight. And that also would go on and impact crop yields as well. So you have two effects. You have your carbon absorption capability of vegetation would decline. So then that might increase carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And you might have issues around food. Now, it's quite interesting that Sri Lanka, a few years ago, they decided to ban synthetic fertilizer. And people like Greenpeace were like, yay, you know, heroes, they're leading the way. And that happened in the springtime. And by the November, they very quietly reversed this ban, having suffered a complete economic collapse and required an IMF bailout. They'd gone from being a net exporter of rice to not being able to feed their own people and had food riots. So, you know, mess with this stuff at your peril.
Doesn't this speak to the sort of, you know, the reality of climate change? I mean, because I really, at this point, don't really believe it's really happening in a way that we have to do anything about. So, for example, you get this kind of reporting that it's slightly windy, or it's going to be 25 degrees.
Horror heat wave.
Don't go outside. And I remember I was driving, I think, to Bristol about 6 months ago, and it was, you know, there was going to be a storm. The warning is stay at home. And like, it was just slightly breezy.
Yeah.
And so they're coming out with all this stuff all the time. And I think what it is, I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe that there is a cabal of people who are saying, let's frighten everybody to death, you know, like COVID. I think what it is that there are institutions in the country, in different sectors like healthcare and climate, and they're imbued with a sort of safetyist culture. And they're paying people, public relations people, to communicate. And these people are paid to communicate, and what they communicate is the warnings that that they were set up, the thing they were set up to warn about or to worry about. They communicate warnings about this because that's their job. Otherwise, they'd be out of a job.
Well, and also there's been times when the Environmental Agency, for example, got criticised for not issuing the right types of flood warnings. And so now I think people are just going too far the other way. Although there is some element of, I won't say conspiracy, but the Met Office publishes data from weather stations that don't exist.
Yes.
Some of the weather stations are, so there's one in St James's Park surrounded on 3 sides with concrete walls in quite a small enclosure, and on the other side you have a porter cabin with a generator. Now, that's not going to be giving you genuine environmental readings. A lot of other weather stations are at airports, which are huge heat sinks. So then you get these data and this reporting, oh, it's going to be, you know, the hottest May since, you know, records began. And it's like, well, yeah, but that's because the way you're keeping your records is really not neutral. And also you're making stuff up, you know, because those 103 weather stations that don't exist and you're publishing data for, that's made up. That's not real data. So you start getting this reporting, oh, we measured 30.2 degrees in Heathrow or whatever, and it's like, well, that's an artificially high number. It doesn't reflect the actual temperature that people were experiencing. And yeah, it was whatever it was yesterday, and I just thought I'd go and sit in the garden because I'm a bit pasty and could do with a bit of sun. Never mind this hiding from the horror heat
Vitamin
wave.
D.
You know?
Anybody else?
No, and they're talking about, they give you a subsidy for the heat pump itself, but not for the insulation or for the new radiators because it's low-grade heat, so you need a bigger radiator. And they work less well in cold weather because you have to divert some of the energy to make the outdoor bit warmer so it works properly. And obviously then that energy is not being used for actual heating indoors where it's needed. But then people say, oh, but they work really well in Scandinavia. Well, what they don't tell you is that a lot of people in Scandinavia have more than one heat pump, but also far more people in Scandinavia have a wood-burning stove. More than 90% of Norwegians have a wood-burning stove and use it, and only about a quarter of homes have a heat pump. In Sweden, when they tried to restrict the use of wood, they had actual riots, and they had to stop that idea. So when people say, oh yeah, heat pumps work pretty well in cold weather, well, yeah. Well, no, they don't, and they don't work adequately enough. And the fact that people in Scandinavia use them is only part of the story because they're all using supplemental heating, either more heat pumps or wood-burning stoves. And that's the bit that you won't hear the government tell you.
Why is gas so expensive? I mean, is it Ukraine and Russia and all that?
So actually it started off with COVID. And gas prices began to rise in September 2021, which was obviously 5 months before the invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
During COVID, we saw a huge reduction in economic activity, and so a lot of gas production was shut in. And once you shut in certain production, it's quite difficult and time-consuming to get it running again. It's not just turning a tap on and off. And so it then took time. Demand recovered faster than the supply could be brought back on stream. So that started pushing prices up in late 2021. And then obviously in February, you had Russia invading Ukraine. Now, the timing of this probably wasn't coincidental. You know, they were probably looking at this energy market stress and thinking this would be quite a good time to take an action of that nature. But then, of course, Europe wanted to stop buying gas from Russia and needed to replace all of that gas. But we've actually seen gas fall significantly since then. And the reason is that there's new production coming on stream. There are new gas fields opening all around the world. In another year or so, we could be back at pre-crisis levels. And what people forget about gas prices is that they were very low and very stable for over 2 decades before 2021. I've got a report being published on Monday about the true affordability of net zero. Plug. It's a free report, so I don't really need to plug it. But I calculated that since 2006, we've spent almost £220 billion in today's money pursuing decarbonisation that hasn't given us any economic benefits. If we just stuck with gas and not tried to do everything else, we would have been £220 billion better off. No, I mean, and this is an excellent point. We've seen significant deindustrialization in the last couple of decades, and high energy costs are making that continue. The current government is making that significantly worse by burdening businesses with higher taxes and also higher employment costs. So it's a sort of trifecta of bad news that's very difficult for business and industry to withstand. Now, whether the US is the right location or other places, obviously the whole tariff situation plays into that. And I'm not an expert on those things, but we've made our energy too expensive, and it's just fundamentally uncompetitive. And as we were saying earlier, offshoring our electricity, offshoring our manufacturing to places where electricity is cheaper but dirtier does nothing for the planet. It increases emissions. So all the virtue signalling we're getting, and Ed Miliband saying we have a climate emergency, it's necessary to act, his actions are making emissions worse. So if you believe the argument that carbon dioxide emissions are creating a climate emergency, you need to be voting against Ed Miliband, because what he's doing is increasing global emissions. So when energy became more expensive, credit became a huge issue. And actually the reason so many of our suppliers went bankrupt, half of the energy suppliers operating in Britain failed in the end of 2021, was a combination of the price cap and poor credit. And since then, Ofgem had to start allowing suppliers to make a little bit more money, because otherwise they were just too financially shaky to keep going. And when suppliers fail, that costs consumers money, because they tend to fail and take a lot of consumers' money with them. The point about carbon trading. So carbon, it's talked about as a commodity, but it's not. It actually behaves more like cash, because the governments control the supply of carbon allowances, which is the thing that gets traded. And so a little bit like the way that central banks can print money, governments can just issue more allowances, and that really impacts the way that these markets trade. When Brexit happened, we separated the UK carbon trading scheme from the European carbon trading scheme, and because of deindustrialization, we had a surplus of allowances, which kept our carbon prices lower than Europe up until January, when Keir Starmer decided he wanted to harmonize carbon prices with Europe. So our carbon prices went from 35 to 45 pounds a tonne pretty much overnight. Now they went up to 53, they've come back just below 50 in the last couple of days. And European carbon prices, they're sort of in the mid-50s now in pound terms, because they've declined a little bit. But just that simple action of saying you wanted to harmonise carbon prices was going to add about £200 million onto electricity bills. That's industrial as well as domestic, but £200 million just from harmonising the carbon price.